So welcome to our latest Q&A video. Hope everyone is doing well, staying reasonably safe. So there's some good questions this week and answered some via email, and then the rest we'll do here. So first question is whether there was a significant backlash against the Electoral College after Bush versus Gore. What we saw in 2020, lots of Democrats criticizing the Electoral College and how this related to what happened in 2016. The answer to this is yes and no, in an interesting way. One of the weird things about the 2000 election, we know how it ended up, so it's easy to kind of forget what came before, was that there actually was a decent amount of talk about the Electoral College in August and especially in September and early October of 2000. But the sense was there was at least some chance that this election was going to end with one winner of the popular vote and one winner of the Electoral College. But the sense was that this was going to benefit Gore. That is, that Bush would win the Electoral College, Bush would win the popular vote, and Gore would win the Electoral College. Of course, we know what happened. The reason for the switch is that in the last 10 days or so of the campaign, Bush does drop, Gore rises, right? I talked about this, remember, in the snippets with the drunk driving arrest, which really sort of hurt Bush. But what happened was that Bush's support collapsed disproportionately in overwhelmingly blue states. And you can see it on this map here, especially in the Northeast, in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and in California. Bush's social conservatism, he talked a lot about being a born-again evangelical, played very poorly in these areas. But of course, Gore was going to carry all of these states anyway, so these extra votes got him nothing. We remember 2000 because of what happened in Florida. But it's easy to imagine a very different outcome. Assume, first of all, that Gore picked up 10,000 more votes, 1,000 more votes and won Florida. And that this late popular vote surge didn't go to Gore, that he won New York by 10 points rather than 20, California the same way. And so the net result then would have been a Gore win in the Electoral College, because again, he would have won Florida, with the Republicans complaining about the fact that the winner of the popular vote, Bush, didn't win in the Electoral College. And the reason for that is that even in, with Gore kind of gaining ground in 2000, there were 5 states that were decided by a margin of 0.5% or less, which is an extraordinarily close margin for a presidential contest. One of those, of course, was Florida, which was decided by a margin of 0.01%. But the other 4, which you can see on the map, the lighter of the light blue states, were Oregon, New Mexico, Iowa, and Wisconsin. So Gore actually won more really, really close states than Bush did. So the fact that Democrats were kind of gearing up in the fall of 2000 to defend the Electoral College kind of made it hard for them to turn around immediately after Florida and say the Electoral College is terrible. They got there, of course. I mean, partisans on both sides always adjust their arguments, but it did take them a couple of weeks. So it's a kind of odd trivia about the 2000 election that we can easily forget, that most commentators, if they thought the Electoral College was going to benefit any candidate, assumed it was actually going to benefit Gore rather than Bush. Second question, are there any parallels between Starr and Muller? Muller was incompetent as Starr. Is there any particular reason why the report went out of its way attempting to humiliate Hillary? And I think these two questions are related. I do think there are parallels between Starr and Muller in that Muller was attempting to avoid what he saw as Starr's significant mistakes. There was a sense that Starr became overly emotional, that he, because he was convinced the Clintons were problematic, he didn't engage in the best prosecutorial practice, and that he got too far ahead of the evidence in his report. And you do see some of this with Muller, where Muller tends to be in some ways overly cautious in his handling of matters. And I think that it was the report's treatment of Hillary that caused probably the most problem among legal commentators with how Starr handled this. But there, in fact, was a particular reason why Starr was so angry at Hillary, and it related to these law firm records that were conveniently lost for a couple of years and then discovered suddenly in January of 1996. And the backdrop here, remember that Starr's inquiry began with this curious land deal in Arkansas called Whitewater. The Clintons were partners with then friends, Jim and Susan McDougal. The proposed retirement home lost money. I mean, it's probably hard for all of us to imagine why people wouldn't want a luxury retirement home in Northwest Arkansas, but incredibly, it didn't take off. And then the allegation was that Jim McDougal had improperly used money from a bank, from a savings and loan that he controlled, to cover up the losses from Whitewater. And then the savings and loan had gone bankrupt, and under FDIC, the federal government had to pay off the debt. So the Clintons, this was the allegation, turns out not to be true, that the Clintons were engaged in corrupt practices. Bill, the argument is that he was inappropriately using his government authority. The argument with Hillary was that she was involved. Hillary was a high-powered attorney in Arkansas when Bill was governor. The argument with Hillary was that she used her work at Rose Law Firm to represent McDougal and to try to help him in his corruption. Hillary said she basically had no connection to McDougal while she was at the firm. So Starr subpoenaed the law firm records to determine one way or another whether she had the connection. The law records that they find, these are photocopies of them, show that in fact, despite her earlier claims, Hillary was involved in legal representation of McDougal. She maintained that it was a relatively minimal connection, but not, the record sort of suggested otherwise. And so Starr, by this point, Starr had really moved on from this aspect of the inquiry. So Starr was convinced that Hillary basically had gamed the system, that she had withheld evidence. Again, there's no direct evidence that she had done so, but it was awfully odd that these records weren't found in the White House. It's not as if there were tons of crates of records around that people couldn't have looked. Starr felt that Hillary had kind of gamed the system to avoid answering hard questions about the record. And so when he had the chance to humiliate her in in his report, he did seem to go out of his way to do so in ways that really hurt his credibility and the credibility of the report. All of this, by the way, is a reminder of the very, very unusual role that Hillary played as First Lady, someone who was an active participant in public policy issues, both while her husband was president, but also before, during his time as governor of Arkansas. Mentioned that the years of progress in the American public it's going to likely be more in favor of same-sex marriage. Why so? So is it because there'll be more of a progressive view on the topic, or less importance due to it being already legalized? And I suspect the correct answer here is a little bit of both. So there are two elements here. So the first is this chart. This is from Pew polling. It polls generational. This poll is from 2019. And one of the things you should notice from the chart is that younger voters tend to favor same-sex marriage more than slightly older voters, still, and then senior citizens are less favorable. Although one thing from this chart you should see also is that in all four of these demographic groups, support has risen. But in general, support for same-sex marriage is higher among younger voters for reasons that should be self-evident. Younger voters they've gone to school with gay and lesbian students. They may have gone to school with kids of gay and lesbian couples. They've been around LGBT people for all of their lives, whereas someone who's over 65, may not have met an openly gay person until, well into adulthood, maybe didn't see a gay or lesbian person until they saw Ellen on TV or something like that. That they're it's simply different life experiences for them. But the second question here, less important because it's being already legalized, I think is also really important. The key arguments against same-sex marriage are basically religious arguments, which are made in good faith. People who see marriage as primarily a religious institution, who come from faith traditions that do not recognize same-sex marriage, and who basically say, look, we want a marriage policy that reflects our religious beliefs. The problem with that, of course, is that can't be the policy justification in terms of a government policy, because that would violate the First Amendment. You can't have government policies that advance specific religious interests. And so the public policy arguments against same-sex marriage depended heavily on basically the institution not existing. The two key arguments raised were that allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry would weaken the overall institution of marriage by decoupling marriage from the belief that its primary purpose was procreation and producing new life, and then secondarily that children raised by gay and lesbian couples would not do as well as children raised by straight couples. And as long as there were no states that allowed gay or lesbian couples to marry, or as long as there were only a couple of states that allowed it, these arguments couldn't really be proven or disproven. They were predictions. Now that all 50 states can, gay and lesbian couples can marry in all 50 states, and these predictions basically haven't come true. I mean, marriage hasn't collapsed. There's basically no evidence that kids of gay or lesbian couples do less well than kids of straight couples. The public policy debate about this is over. Now, one thing I think that on the chart here, if you look at opposition in the U.S. to interracial marriage, which is ruled on bans on interracial marriage were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1967. There is kind of a similar path where there was significant opposition, in this case overwhelming opposition, and then it gradually subsided over time. And now it's only around 15% of Americans who oppose interracial marriage, which is, of course, incredibly high number. I suspect that the opposition to same-sex marriage is always going to be somewhat larger than that, because again, people who come from faith traditions who don't recognize same-sex marriage and who see marriage as a primarily or even exclusively religious institution are likely always going to be opposed. But a margin of 70-30, which seems to be more or less where we are now and where we're likely to remain in the coming years, it seems very, very unlikely that that's going to change much. Question on what was happening with healthcare policies during Bush's presidency. This is a really good question. And how if they changed during his first term as compared to his second. There is a major healthcare initiative in Bush's first term, which is one of the most controversial legislative measures of the last 25 years because of what occurs in the actual vote. It's a prescription drug plan. In 2000, in the election of 2000, there were significant concerns among seniors that Medicare was not covering the skyrocketing prices of prescription drugs. And so seniors, and of course, think of what's going on here. Imagine the pharmaceutical industry as it existed when Medicare is created in 1964, and the pharmaceutical industry by the time we get to 2000s. It's all pills for all kinds of stuff now, but these often were quite expensive, and Medicare had strict limitations. So the prescription drug plan is to dramatically expand the scope of Medicare. We don't think of Bush as a big government conservative, but in this respect, he was. To satisfy a constituency that was emerging as a critical constituency of the Republican Party. The party was doing increasingly well with voters over 65. So in effect, Bush was taking care of his supporters. What made this provision so controversial, however, was that it was written in such a way that the pharmaceutical companies did pretty well. If this had been a Democratic bill, there would have been more cost controls. The Republican argument was, look, the pharmaceutical companies are doing all of the trials, very expensive trials, to develop these drugs. I mean, think of what's going on now with the COVID vaccine attempts. And therefore, the government shouldn't come in and nickel and dime them and try to make it hard for them to make a profit. So this was, all things considered, a very favorable bill towards the pharmaceutical industry. And as a result, it was very, very close in the House. The final vote, before there were a couple of vote switches once it was clear it was going to pass, was 216 to 215. But that was deceptive. Under House rules, under Senate rules as well, when there is a roll call vote, the roll call vote is supposed to last for 15 minutes. And once the 15 minutes end, it ends. If you don't show up in that 15 minutes, your vote doesn't count. At the end of 15 minutes, the vote on the prescription drug plan had lost by 4 points. A combination of Democrats and anti-spending Republicans had seemingly sunk the bill. But House Speaker Dennis Hastert kept the vote open for 6 hours. It's a little longer than 15 minutes. And he and his the House Whip, a guy named Tom DeLay, very aggressively, some argued over the line, persuaded a handful of House Republicans to switch their vote to get it over the top, 216 to 215. So this, in some ways, it violated the spirit of House rules, but nonetheless, the measure gets through, and this law remains on the books today. It's incorporated into Obamacare. Bush basically does nothing on healthcare in his second term. He promotes a philosophy called individual retirement accounts, where people can take money, individual health insurance accounts. People can take money, put it in a special tax-free fund, which they can then use for healthcare expenses over the year. It's not really a terribly useful thing in terms of overall public policy, but there are no major initiatives during the second term, in part because this was such a tumultuous vote in the first term. Question on Hurricane Katrina, which, yes, it's an awful event. And was it like the hurricane in Puerto Rico the last year, where the government didn't help until the public and social media began to call them out for it? That's actually a really good comparison in terms of the response. In both cases, I think that arguments of sort of systemic racism in U.S. public policy often can be not of tremendous use, because if everything's racist, then how do we distinguish between events? But it's very hard to argue that racism didn't play a critical role in the response to Katrina, and frankly in the response to Puerto Rico after the hurricane last year. In the case of Katrina, the victims were overwhelmingly African American, and they were overwhelmingly poor, in some cases extremely poor, people who basically couldn't get out of New Orleans. Sometimes they didn't have a car. They had no way of actually leaving the city. So in that respect, I think the comparison is comparable. There is another critical element to Katrina, which is not present not present in this way, at least in the Puerto Rican hurricane. And that is that significant portions of southern Louisiana are below sea level. And climate change, although it's affecting the entire world, obviously, climate change has had a disproportionately harmful effect on southern Louisiana by, in effect, sinking large portions of the region perpetually below sea level. And the New Orleans area was protected by these things called levees, or sort of hard seawalls, which were constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and then a sophisticated program of pumps that were designed. So the idea was that that the levees would block most of the flood water, and any flood water that tumbled over them, they would pump. But you can take a look at this levee. It's it's kind of small. It's a little old, and the levee system breaks down during Katrina. The pumping system then also breaks down, and here's a street in New Orleans during the aftermath of the hurricane. It's basically just entirely flooded. So this is a case where not just climate change, but the way climate change intersected with the particular geography of southern Louisiana made what would have been a terrible situation infinitely worse. And I showed in the lecture snippet, I showed an outside view of the Superdome. This was an inside view during Katrina. So this is the football field here, and these people are lined up on cots. There were only a handful of working restrooms in the stadium. It was an embarrassment to the country. In terms of what explains the response beyond systemic racism, this is a case of massive bureaucratic failure. The head of FEMA under the Bush administration was not competent. A guy named Michael Brown. He underestimated the problem. The governor of Louisiana, who was the sharpest of the three policymakers here, a woman named Kathleen Blanco, who just recently passed away, was caught between a New Orleans mayor who ultimately would go to be found guilty of ethics issues after corruption issues after the response to Katrina. So she wasn't getting a lot of assistance locally, and a Bush administration with which she did not at all get along. She had been very narrowly elected governor, a Democratic governor of a fairly deep red state. So there were political tensions there as well, and so there really was no coordination between the local government, state government, and national government, which compounded the problem. And here too, I think, going back to the question, there's a similarity to Puerto Rico. It's clear that the Trump people despise the mayor of San Juan and vice versa. And the governor of Puerto Rico was ethics issues in Puerto Rican politics with the governor in the last year or so. So there were similar bureaucratic issues. So that's all we have for the question and answer video for this week. Thanks for the questions, which were excellent, and hope everyone is staying safe and as well. And I will talk to you soon. Okay, bye bye.